Hello everyone. This short video is going to talk about cellular respiration. Um, we've learned a little bit about ATP and how ATP is the sort of energy currency for cells. It's what cells use when energy is required to do a process. ATP is very often the source of energy to drive those processes. And we learned that plants can use sunlight to make ATP to help them with the process of photosynthesis. And now we'll learn about how all of us heterotrophs get all the ATP that we need to keep our cell processes going. So in the video for section 8.1, when we talked about ATP, I drew this analogy out that organisms take in food as a source of energy, and there are lots and lots of different kinds of food molecules that can provide us with energy, but those raw materials, those different types of food molecules, cannot be used directly to power the cell processes that keep us alive. In the same way that there are lots of fuel sources for us to produce electricity, but we have to take those fuel sources and take them to a power plant and generate electricity to power the processes that take place in our homes that are electrically driven. So it kind of works that way in cells again. Mitochondria, which are found in plant cells and in animal cells, are the organelles where the breakdown of food to make ATP takes place. That's where cellular respiration takes place. So in just a gram of glucose, a common type of sugar found in living things, like photosynthesis, there is a summary equation that represents all of cell respiration, and it is the opposite, basically, of the summary reaction for photosynthesis. And like the summary reaction for photosynthesis, it also is completely misleading to think that this is what happens. In fact, this reaction, as it's written, is the reaction for the combustion, for the burning of glucose. And you can do that reaction. You can burn some glucose, but that's not what's going on in our body. But it is useful as a summary because indeed the molecules that go into the process are oxygen and a simple carbohydrate like glucose, and the molecules that come out are carbon dioxide and water. So, respiration takes place in the mitochondria and in the cytoplasm of the cell. And the process is cyclical. It's going on all of the time. And as we use up ATP energy, the ADP and the phosphate that results when ATP is used for energy are the raw materials for making more ATP. And the breakdown of the food is what provides the energy to put those two pieces back together, the ADP and the phosphate. First part of glycolysis is the initial breaking down of the glucose. And I said the first part of glycolysis, the first part of respiration is glycolysis. That happens out in the cytoplasm. The products of glycolysis go inside the mitochondria to finish the process of aerobic cellular respiration and to get most of the energy that's released when we break down food. So again, just a reminder that when we're doing respiration, it's all about this cycle of recharging our ATP, putting together the ADP and the inorganic phosphate that would result when we use ATP for energy. So breaking down that ATP, going to release a little energy to do a process. We got to put the ADP and phosphate back together to regenerate ATP to do more work in the cell. So let's go through these different parts of cellular respiration in a little bit more detail. Glycolysis, the part that happens out in the cytoplasm, that word literally means splitting sugar. Glyco means sugar. Lysis means to split or to cut. And that's really just about all that's happening. The glucose, remember the formula C6H12O6, but we've simplified it by just showing 6 carbon atoms attached. And this is kind of the way biochemists think about this process. They sort of trace the carbon atoms through the process. And glucose is split first into a couple of molecules that are intermediates, and then ultimately into these 2 molecules that will enter the mitochondria and take part in further reactions of respiration. Those molecules are called pyruvic acid. You're not going to need to remember those names. But during glycolysis, we use a little energy sort of to jumpstart the process. You can see the 2 ATP being converted to 2 ADP. But then in the second half of glycolysis, we get those 2 back plus 2 more. So overall, glycolysis will give us 2 recharged ATP molecules for each glucose we break down. But that is just a tiny fraction of the energy that's available in glucose. The rest of that will be released in the mitochondria. So why do we bother with this glycolysis bit out there in the cytoplasm? I thought the mitochondria were the powerhouses of the cell. Let's get into the mitochondria. Well, it's true that glycolysis is a little less efficient than what happens in the mitochondria in terms of producing ATP. But it's also a really important part of how we metabolize energy in our cells. And virtually all organisms do it in a very similar way. And the reactions are very fast. They can make some ATP super fast, even when there is little to no oxygen available. And so that is often helpful for us. If you're running a sprint, 50 meters, 100-meter dash, you will, within the first couple of seconds, use up the oxygen in your muscle cells because you're exercising so intensely, so vigorously. But your cells can keep going because they can keep doing glycolysis very quickly, making ATP to keep the cell powered even when there's not much oxygen around. Fermentation is something that we need to understand. When there is no oxygen available, glycolysis can make some energy for us using glucose, but the products of glycolysis need to be recycled so that we can keep doing more glycolysis. Normally, if there's oxygen available, those products of glycolysis go into the mitochondria and they get recycled and pushed back out into the cytoplasm as the aerobic reactions of cellular respiration take place in the mitochondria. Aerobic means with oxygen. If there's no oxygen available, then organisms use a series of just a few simple reactions to get things reset so that more glycolysis can take place. And there are 2 different types of fermentation, and we'll just touch on both of those real quick. There is alcohol fermentation, and this is where the products of glycolysis, pyruvic acid, are broken down into carbon dioxide and ethanol. And that's what happens when you have yeast that are added to dough to make bread, and they make a little bit of alcohol, which bakes off in the oven when you bake the bread. Or when you brew beer or make wine, the same thing is happening there. Yeasts are responsible for making the alcohol that are in those types of alcoholic beverages. And if it's beer, they put a cap on the bottle so the bubbles stay in there. If it's wine, it's kept in the open so it's not bubbly. And then there is lactic acid fermentation. And there are lots of different types of bacteria that do this. And there are lots of important food products that are made through lactic acid fermentation. Lots of dairy products like cheeses, sour cream, yogurt. Those are all made using lactic acid bacteria. And in this brand of fermentation, there's just a different end product. Instead of alcohol and carbon dioxide, pyruvic acid is converted into lactic acid, and that can be used as a food source later on too. And so that's what happens when we have glycolysis and no oxygen is available. We have to keep glycolysis going by regenerating the stuff or recycling the products of glycolysis in the cytoplasm through fermentation. But when oxygen is available, which is most of the time in cells, those products of glycolysis, the pyruvic acid and other products from the breakdown of glycolysis, those are carried into the mitochondria where a couple of different complex series of chemical reactions take place to further harvest the energy that was in our original glucose molecule. And if you want to know details about the Krebs cycle or the electron transport chain and how that works, I'm happy to talk to you about it, and it's really kind of interesting, and it's one of the complex bits of biochemistry that we understand pretty well. So if you're interested in that, I'm happy to talk to you about it, but I'm not going to ask you detailed questions about that. It's something that I think is more appropriate for when you take AT or AP biology in the future. So you just need to know that cellular respiration consists of these two sort of different phases. The cytoplasmic phase, glycolysis, where we break down glucose into 2-3 carbon chunks, and then the products of glycolysis go into the mitochondrion, where oxygen is used to completely break down those pyruvic acid molecules and to release all the energy that's available to make ATP. And depending on how efficient the process is in the cell, you get the 2 ATP from glycolysis, and through the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain in the mitochondria, you can get up to 36 ATP made using what's left of the glucose, those 2 pyruvic acid molecules.